Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry about that, gentlemen, but I'm here.
No
Great to have
problem.
you back.
I believe it was my technology, not yours. So
Well,
I
John,
will not push any buttons right now.
well, we're going to turn it over to John, who will introduce our wonderful guest today, and take it away, John.
Thank you. The last 2 months have presented many challenges to us individually and as an industry. I am proud of how our members have responded and served the public during this time. Some of our previous webinars have covered aspects of the crisis that we're facing during and look at the outlook on the economy, real estate industry, working virtually on behalf of our clients, examining government assistance available, and working through title and mortgage issues. Today, our comptroller, Peter Francho, has agreed to talk with us about the fiscal challenges facing our state. Over 60% of local government revenue is generated by real estate taxes. So the fiscal outlook is important to us and the homeowners and buyers and sellers we represent. Peter Francho has served as the comptroller since 2007. Before that, he was a delegate for 20 years representing District 20 of Montgomery County. In fact, as a delegate, Comptroller Francho sponsored the top bill for priority of ours, the semi-annual property tax bill. As many of you know, Comptroller Francho has announced his plans to run for governor in 2022. Governor Francho, Comptroller Francho, guess I was getting ahead of myself. We thank you for the productive working relationship we've had over these many years and appreciate your continued service with Maryland. I hereby give you Peter Francho.
Thank you. That's probably undeserved, all those nice words, but I do recall the legislation that you mentioned. I was given that legislation to sponsor because I asked the leadership to give me something that I could do on the Appropriations Committee, and they said, why don't you take up this bill? And I said, God, that's terrific. And only later did I learn they gave it to me because for 15 straight years it had lost in the General Assembly. And what happened was that Joel Rosner, your lobbyist then, he may still be affiliated, Bill Castelli, who is fabulous, set me up to testify on the legislation. And one of the experts who came in said, oh, by the way, the state is going to receive under federal law a huge amount of, the individuals around the state are going to receive a huge amount of money for half of the 12-month payments that they've been obligated to pay if you change the law. And I think it was hundreds of millions of dollars, $900 million going back to Marylanders. Well, as soon as that fact came out, the bill went through the legislature like a hot knife through butter. And yes, I benefited from that. Thank you for mentioning that legislative win years ago. And now as comptroller, I continue to have tremendous support for the real estate industry. I love the optimism and the ability to see the glass half full rather than totally empty. I appreciate the pandemic's impact upon your economic activity. I applaud the fact that you're able to negotiate some kind of essential relationship and you're able to survive. Several houses have been sold in the last couple of weeks on my home street of Sycamore Avenue, so I know that there's activity. It's not normal, but hats off to all of your membership for being innovative and entrepreneurial and benefiting the great state of Maryland. I will say right now that it is unclear what we're going to face down the road. We have 700,000 Marylanders who have filed for first-time unemployment in the last 9 weeks. Half of those will never be employed again, our experts estimate. I'm hopeful that as we manage our way through the situation we're in, that the Congress is going to adopt a final stimulus plan that will allow the states and local jurisdictions to bridge their budget gaps, which are going to be enormous because of the pandemic. I'm hopeful that a vaccine will be developed sooner rather than later. I'm hopeful that there's not a second wave of the virus that comes through and shuts us down again. We use Moody's, Mark Zandi's economic analysis to make a lot of our predictions. Worst case is catastrophic as far as state revenues. Not that that's my top priority, because I keep saying to people, our top priority should be your budgets and your neighbors' budgets and the businesses that you interact with. Those are the budgets that should be front and center for us. But you asked about the public budgets. Worst case, we're talking several $billion need to be cut from the state budget and resulting trickle-down cuts to the counties and the municipalities. Best case scenario, probably $1 billion has to be cut in real time in the next month from the upcoming fiscal year budget. That's going to be painful. I'm looking to the governor for direction. He and the legislative leadership are going to have to decide where to go. My optimism, and I'll conclude with this, is that all of the challenges facing us, which are significant, we're more than ready to deal with, I think. Governor Hogan has been aggressive on the health protections and restrictions. I think that's appropriate. I think it's now appropriate that he's beginning to loosen them up. To the extent we can do that safely, I think that's something that we all support. What happens after we get back to semi-normal status is of great interest to me, because I think it gives us a chance as a state to reinvent ourselves and not be a state that's constantly viewed nationally as high tax, high regulatory, not sympathetic to property owners, particularly retirees who complain about the tax situation and move out of our state. I think it gives us a chance, if we begin to focus on keeping money in people's pockets and providing good customer service to people and to businesses, and having government be a constructive junior partner helping. Obviously, we need to regulate. It's not as if we don't have a role, but it should be a junior status, helping the private sector produce jobs and wages, because we're going to need them desperately down the road. We're talking years as far as the recovery, not months. And trust me, the stock market could go down just as fast as it goes up. So let's not get too reckless in response to whatever's going on up on Wall Street right now. The Main Street economy in Maryland needs attention of everybody: Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives. We have 140,000 small businesses. Almost 40,000 of them may never open again. That's a sobering fact. I think everything we do after we get through the immediate future should be focused on keeping money in the pockets of Maryland citizens, keeping money in the pockets of small businesses. We should bias and weight our public policies around small businesses, because they are the backbone of the state's economy. But the actions never meet our rhetoric. So my philosophy is, coming out of this situation, let's reinvent ourselves as a state that's moderate on taxes, moderate on regulations, focus like a laser on small businesses and Main Street, helping those entities make Maryland a welcoming place for people to move to. And as I mentioned halfway through this, a place where seniors can retire and live in their homes without being chased out of the state through high taxes. So that's kind of the program. I've emphasized over this is my 14th year as comptroller. customer service, respect the taxpayer, respond to the taxpayer, get results for the taxpayer. Someone nicely mentioned running for governor. If I ever am lucky enough to be governor, trust me, Maryland is going to get a government, not that they agree with all the time, but it's going to be a government that's high quality, competent, responsive, and respectful, and gets good results. And that's the kind of government Marylanders deserve. And I think down the road, we have some opportunity to deliver that. Let me stop talking, turn it over to your questions, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. This is Chuck Caskey, CEO here at Maryland Realtors. Thanks again for joining us today. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you great. I hope I didn't put everybody to sleep out there.
No. We have a couple of questions already. I have some prepared, but people are already kind of chiming in. Please, everybody, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A section so we can hear directly from Mr. Francho. One, I think, pretty obvious question, and thank you, Teresa, is Kirwan. So we could spend a lot of the day on Kirwan. I don't think we do want to hear from you, at least in terms of what the General Assembly did, what the governor did, and where you think that might be headed for either the next session if there's overrides, or what your thoughts are generally on Kirwan. And specifically, of course, we're concerned with the main thing that we are concerned with, obviously, from the real estate perspective, is that local governments don't just turn to real estate for additional revenue. Not that we don't support the goals of Kirwan, but obviously, if you were there, I think you were there when we had our rally, obviously taxing real estate is an issue for us. So if you could give us some of your thoughts on Kirwan, current situation, and where you think that might be headed.
Thank you. It's an excellent question. I know everybody on the phone supports the goals of education. All of us do. We have a good K through 12 system. It needs to be improved. It needs to be reformed. Kirwan, when they passed it at the end of the last session, right in the face of the approaching pandemic, I suggested that it was absolutely the worst time to impose new taxes, new obligations on future legislative sessions or future payments by Maryland taxpayers. So I was opposed to Kirwan, supportive of the concept of reform, but frankly, we didn't have the money before the pandemic, and we clearly don't have the money now. So I understand the governor's veto, although he may have done it for other reasons, as far as I know. But the fact of the matter is, there just isn't the money there. It is not there. It's not going to be there. Therefore, we have to rethink what the architects of Kirwan did not realize was going to happen. Obviously, nobody did, which is this economic calamity that we have following the pandemic. So what's that going to look like? I don't know. I do think that K through 12 education is going to look significantly different, at least for the next several years, as far as transportation, as far as meal sessions, as far as auditorium gatherings, as far as how the classrooms are set up, all of which has not been anticipated at all by the architects at Kirwan. So I think they're going to have to go back to the drawing board, both fiscally and substantively. And what should we do about education in the meantime? Obviously, we need to experiment. We need to be creative. Something isn't working in education. We're spending a lot of money and we're not getting the results that people normally are expecting. And I'll just conclude by saying, I was in the legislature when we voted for the last big reform package. It wasn't called Kirwan, it was called Thornton. It cost several $1 billion rather than $4 billion. When I asked how we were going to pay for it among my colleagues, they said Kathleen Townsend, who was then running for governor, is going to be elected because she's a Democrat. and she's agreed to raise the sales tax or something like that as a source of revenue. So we all voted for it. Of course, Kathleen lost, Bob Ehrlich, and that funding obligation placed enormous stress on the state and county budgets, and it did not produce the results as promised. So what I'm saying is, let's take a smaller amount of money, let's spend it on things that make sense and other communities have used to upgrade the quality of the education and the performance of the kids. And let's begin to think about funding perhaps on a higher scale some of these successful experiments and drop some of the experiments that don't seem to work very well. That, I think, is a good path forward for K through 12. But Kirwan, I just cannot even imagine my party overriding the governor's veto. I mean, unless they decouple it from the funding, because the money is just not there.
Yeah, that's an important point. And you mentioned going back. Would you support the commission? I'm not starting over per se, but revisiting the recommendations in light of the new economic reality?
It was exquisitely bad timing to pass it when they did.
Yeah.
It was a very bad process because, as you recall, they jammed it through on a party line vote in the dead of night and then got out of town. So bad timing, bad process. Some of the content should be re-examined, and in the light of the restrictions that the kids are going to have to abide by when they go back to school, hopefully in the fall, maybe some of the components or recommendations can be implemented on a experimental basis so we can test them out and make sure that they work. But the structure itself is right now unusable.
It's a pretty good segue in terms of the revenue shortfalls. I'm sure you're thinking about this almost all the time. We did some little looking into the Bureau of Revenue estimates charts. Some of them are a couple of weeks old now and are probably, given the jobs report from last week and some of the uptick or I guess that some of the revenue projections turned out to be overly pessimistic. Do you have any newer information in terms of tax collections and revenue estimates as of even from last week that are different because of the most recent report?
Yeah, no, the most recent report is not something that we're breaking out the champagne over.
Yeah.
I mean, it basically, as far as I am told by our economists, 2.5 million jobs were added, but they were basically the old jobs that people had lost. These are not new jobs in a growing, expanding economy, number one. Number two, they said we're going to see the same kind of bump up. We didn't see much of a bump up in Maryland, but we're going to see the same bump up next month. And I just urge everybody not to, as I say, break out the champagne and think things are all better and over. They aren't. And I mentioned at the beginning, we have 700,000 first-time filers for unemployment, 350,000 of whom, from the best studies we have, their jobs are not coming back. A lot of them are in the hospitality industry. And so this idea that obviously the revenues, we have worst case and best case. That's what we use Moody's, Mark Zandi's models for. But our best case scenarios assume that there's a federal payment to the states for their budget gaps, that there's a vaccine, and that there's no second wave with a shutdown. And what we're seeing right now with these demonstrations, because here's the completely unexpected challenge of police brutality and racism and all of the concerns about relations all over the country. That has now created these huge demonstrations where people may or may not be, unfortunately, spreading the infection. So you just cannot right now say we're kind of putting this behind us. We're not putting it behind us until the virus decides to, back off and or we get a vaccine. And so I'm very skeptical about the chest thumping about the job situation. Obviously, it's better to get those jobs back. But then I think I read right afterwards, according to my staff, they misclassified some things and instead of 13%, it should have been more like 16% unemployment. Those are just catastrophically bad numbers, only eclipsed by the 1930s. And as I said, having been around for the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, that was bad. But this recession may or may not move upward as everybody is hoping. In fact, it could be derailed by all sorts of events that we are not anticipating right now. I don't mean to be doom and gloom. I just don't want anybody to sugarcoat this thing and break out the music and say, hey, we're on our way back. We want to make sure we don't go back down. And I don't mean to get into that, but you know what the politics of reopening the economy is. Some people just want to do it as if there's no more virus. Other people want to do it very carefully and incrementally, and I tend to side with the latter rather than the former.
Yeah, that's another good segue because we're coming from such a deep trough that even 1 week or 2 weeks good news is still leaving us with, as you said, reported 13, and that's probably 13% unemployment, which is, as you said, understated. But the larger question, I guess, for us and in real estate especially, people love to talk about the shape of the recovery. Is it U? Is it V? Is it a Nike swoosh? Is it a I've heard even a K-shaped and a square root sign. There's all kinds of shapes of the recovery. And I'd like to get your thoughts on whether there is one single shape and what real estate could be different from the rest of the economy. And you identified a couple of industries where certainly it's going to take much longer: travel, hospitality, those kinds of things. The real estate numbers that we are seeing are very encouraging in terms of real estate activity, listing, showing, sales, new listings, closings are actually very close to, or even in some cases above 2019 levels. So how do we process that different industries are the shape of the recovery is going to be different for each individual industry, and what that might look like for real estate, and then again, how that translates to revenue for the state if real estate continues to add the enormous amount of income or revenue that it does for the economy?
Well, first of all, just be happy you're not in the hospitality industry.
Yeah.
Second of all, realize that, when I mentioned that 2 houses has been sold in the last couple of weeks on my street, they not only sold quickly, they sold at astronomical prices. That may be just my, being asleep as the price of homes goes up, or it may be the proximity to Washington, which is, I'm down in the Montgomery County area, close to DC. But it's pretty stunning how resilient the residential housing sector has been. We would like to continue that. So please let us know where we can partner with you guys. When I say that we have bad timing for taxes, at the state level being increased. I mean the same thing at the county and municipal level. Part of that is just communicating with people that this is, whatever you think about fiscal issues, it's just excruciatingly wrong to raise taxes right now. For example, my hometown of Tacoma Park, very nice municipality, wonderful place to live, just put out their budget for next year, and I believe they're recommending if you can believe it, a 6% increase in the budget, obviously funded by largely by the property taxes that your clients pay. So I'm very sympathetic to the argument that for several years we should lay off of any and all tax increases at the municipal, county, and state level. I don't care what ideology you come from, far left, far right, in the middle. It's just the wrong time to reach into people's pockets right now.
What's the outlook for the current fiscal year, and what kind of deficit are we looking at for next fiscal year at this point?
Well, next fiscal year starts at the end of this month.
Right.
We cut 120 million, which mostly window dressing from the budget we're in right now. There'll be other cuts before us, I believe, at the board meeting on June 17th. As your members know, Maryland, uniquely in the country, has something called the Board of Public Works, which when the legislature's not in session, the treasurer, the governor, and myself, who comprise the Board of Public Works, are authorized to cut any state agency by up to 25% in real time. That's where the 120 million in cuts came from the session before last. I assume at the next session we'll have X amount to make sure that we balance the fiscal year ending June 30th. The real action will take place July 1st and subsequently on the upcoming fiscal budget. And that best case scenario, going to have to easily cut $1.5 billion out of that in real time. That's a painful process. Worst case, we're talking $2.5 billion.
Wow.
And so those are big chunks. They trickle down and put a lot of pressure on the counties. They put a lot of pressure on the municipalities. I'm not suggesting it's not a challenging issue. It is. But once again, I just, ask everybody to put themselves in the shoes of some of your business peers in other sectors around the state, like the restaurant industry, who are going through just tumultuous times right now because of the public health restrictions.
Do you think those will be, and we won't hold you to it, and it's maybe premature, but would those maybe be across the board cuts, or do you have any thoughts, and again, it may be premature, on any specific cuts that you think might help make up that shortfall?
I'm going to defer to the governor and the legislative leaders just because, I'm the comptroller and I'm not really right in the middle of everything. I believe they're going to come up with a package. I will generally defer to them. There are always issues about individual decisions. And let me just pause for a minute here and give everybody who's got a pencil and a piece of paper, I'm going to give you my personal cell phone number. That is 301 area code 332-1961. So when these cuts are before us and they get publicized and there's something that is just out of step with reality, feel free to leave a message or a text on my cell phone number. I probably will not pick it up if I don't recognize the number, but at least you'll have some ability to vent or not vent or suggest something creative once the Board of Public Works is focused on that. I don't think it's wise to bring the legislature back for a special session. A, because that's very cumbersome. B, it's unsafe to have those kind of large gatherings in close quarters. And thirdly, I think the Board of Public Works, whether you're liberal or conservative or Democrat or Republican, it doesn't really matter. When you have to cut things, you have to cut things. And we did it even, I remember very clearly, in 2009, Governor O'Malley bringing more than $1 billion in cuts to a single Board of Public Works meeting. And they had to be adopted because, unlike the federal government, we cannot ignore things like that. So that's kind of the reality. I don't really know what the cuts are going to be. Some I'll agree with, some I won't agree with. Same thing with you guys. If you see something that really sticks out that I should be paying attention to, feel free to text or leave a voicemail.
Sure. There was a couple of comments that people did not get your number. A lot of interest in that. Could you repeat that, please?
Oh, good. Yeah, let me state that when I was a delegate, I could never get hold of a statewide elected official. You know, it was always like, oh, golly, that's a big problem to communicate something directly. So here it is again, 301 area code, because I live over in Montgomery County. 332-1961. Don't be upset if I don't pick the phone up, but I will hear the message, voicemail, or see your text. Happy to try to be of help. I am the comptroller. I'm not the State Department of Assessments and Taxation. I'm not the Commerce Department. I'm not the Unemployment Division, but I am a statewide elected official, and sometimes it helps to be able to reach out.
So speaking a little bit more globally and then again, somewhat even specifically, I know that sounds like a contradiction. Here's a big idea. We in real estate, especially commercial real estate, are in the midst of deciding and trying to figure out, and businesses are trying to figure out what work looks like moving forward. Is telework a new normal? I have a daughter who works in state government, and she's been working from home. And to be honest with you, their office is thinking about whether a lot of people ever really need to go back to an office, as we know in terms what offices usually look like. Is there an opportunity in all of this to reimagine state government and the amount of space, office space, for example, that state government occupies, and whether there are some potential cost savings in shrinking the state government's footprint as far as office space goes?
Of course, sir, it's going to be different. We're just beginning to open up the comptroller's office. We have all been working at home for the last couple of months. I will put quotation marks around the word working. So I'm all for teleworking. I do believe businesses, particularly the private sector as opposed to the public sector, will rethink some of their commercial office needs. And I think that's somewhat of a puzzle right now. I happen to think that we'll move somewhat incrementally, not radically, into the telecommuting era. As far as the revenue implications for the state of Maryland, there are obviously savings to be done if we can get the same or better results from not having to have everybody in an office. But once again, I'm a little conservative as far as predicting that, because we just don't know. I happen to be I grew up I was a elementary school person in the 1950s, and I can remember getting the polio vaccine back then. That was like a crippling disease that affected 50 or 60,000 young kids a year, and that vaccine changed everything. It, you know, all of a sudden you could go and swim, you could go to summer camp, you could go to, you know, you didn't have to, your parents weren't in fear of you getting sick with polio and being paralyzed. So I think medical solutions have got to be at the forefront for us to get back to our normal level of economic, robust prosperity. But I'm the last person to comment on medical issues, and please don't take any medical advice from me ever. I'm a politician. But I do think that we're going to see some hybrid results from the current situation. But ultimately, I hope we have a platform created in our country where we don't have to go through this particularly unfortunate handling of this pandemic, where, you know, somebody says this and then somebody else says that, and if you drive 30 minutes away, you're all of a sudden in a jurisdiction where it's completely different from anything you've ever heard. So that kind of balkanization of recommendations coming from this situation, I think is really, well, I just think it's been a unforced error by government.
I should have asked this in terms of the shortfall. What's your philosophy, or at what point would you recommend taking money from the rainy day fund as opposed to making up the shortfall simply by cuts? Is there, I know there's not a magic formula or anything. What kind of things would you be looking at in order to avoid additional cuts and maybe, you know, dipping into the rainy day fund?
Well, I'm a big fan of dipping into the rainy day fund. It's $1.2 billion, or it was. I advocated or suggested to the governor that he dip into it for $750 million, not to be spent on patching the state budget, but being spent on small business grants all over the state. He agreed, I think it was $150 million could be used for that, for half of it for grants, half of it for loans. That was oversubscribed in 48 hours. I would take the entire $1.2 billion rainy day fund, I think at this point, and turn it into grants for Main Street, mom and pop, small businesses. Big businesses, I think, are pretty much handled at the federal level, and they always get help from Annapolis. But the 140,000 small businesses that I mentioned we have in the state are so important to us. We constantly praise them, but our actions never meet the rhetoric. And so they're the ones that, if we can save them, a lot of them have already made the decision, frankly, and laid off people, and they're not going to open up again. That's tragedy, because every one of them is like a little ecosystem of, you know, employees and vendors and distributors and clients. I mean, it just kills me that they are not going to be able to reopen. But that's already happened. The question is, how do we prevent more from having to close permanently and not being able to reopen? So I would spend, that's what the rainy day fund was designed for, to help tide the state over when we had stormy weather. And we have a hurricane with a tornado on top and a really big thunderstorm on top of both of those things.
We have another big issue kind of question from Bonnie Casper. I think you know Bonnie, former
Yes.
Milan Realtors president. Bonnie would like you to address how we go about maybe considering an overhaul of Maryland's tax structure as a state. Local, you know, obviously local governments are under a lot of constraints. That's a big issue. We could probably spend a whole session on just that. But what are your thoughts on looking at in more broadly or globally at Maryland's tax structure?
Globally, we should just freeze where we are temporarily. No more tax increases, period, for 2 years until we sort out the economic consequences of the pandemic. After that, we need to have a plan, I think, to make Maryland more friendly to seniors who retire, many of them using municipal, county, and state pensions that they have earned. But they move, as soon as they retire, they move out of the state because they view it as a high tax state, and particularly a state that taxes state level many of their pensions. So that's an area where I could see some tax reductions. Then I'm a big fan of public-private partnerships as far as using private sector capital. Voted for the part of most of the governor's plan for widening the 270 and 495 over in the Washington area. And I support the idea of using private sector capital with, public projects, mass transit, highways, bridges, the port of Baltimore, all of those things I think make sense, and that can take some pressure off the budget. But I am in favor of stability, predictability, and certainty. And right now we have a volatile health, economic, and public policy with the demonstrations that are being held all over the country. So that's a very volatile situation. Increasing taxes or decreasing them significantly at this point without really understanding what we're facing, I think would just add to that volatility. So let's stay where we are. No more increases, no radical decreases, because we're not exactly sure if we're going to be able to pay for what we have. And then let's choose to be innovative and experimental. Like all of your members, and I come back to this all the time in the real estate sector, are always nimble and always adjusting and always reinventing themselves. So that's what we need to do as a state. And I think there's an opportunity there once the dust settles and people feel they have enough confidence that government is actually going to fix the potholes and, answer the phone and hold an election without having it look like some Eastern European authoritarian regime, but actually something that gets the results to people with integrity. In other words, a long-winded way of saying, once people have a little bit more trust and confidence in government, and the situation has calmed down on the pandemic, I think then Maryland can reimagine itself as a state much more friendly to business, much more welcoming to people coming to our state, and much more supportive, particularly, as I mentioned over and over again, keeping seniors here in the state, in their homes. That's pretty much of a, I'm trying to think what the right word is. I don't want to call it a radical idea, but yeah, it's a radical change for the state of Maryland, and it would be a huge positive. And our image right now is, unfortunately and somewhat unfairly, negative around the country as far as a place that's welcoming to businesses and to families. And why not take advantage of this particular calamity we're in to put a better foot forward?
Yeah, a lot of our members have that question about retirees, so thank you for raising that. Did the extension?
But if I could just interject for a minute.
Of course.
I mean, these local tax increases are almost invisible to the average member of the public. I'm the comptroller of the state, and I have to I'm stunned to learn that my own city that I live in and I pay taxes in is blithely moving ahead with a tax increase. And I didn't really realize it, but I assume other parts of the state have that going on. It's hidden in the budget, so you have to get a economist almost to show where the increases are. A lot of it is around how the residences are assessed.
Mhm.
So you guys are involved, obviously, from your, your main point of interest, and it's largely funded by property tax increases that are hidden in the assessments.
Yeah, that's another whole session. Again, constant yield and all those kinds of things,
Yeah.
I constant yield. I mean, I understood it. Jack Cade that was his baby. If you remember that, I'm sure. That really didn't, I don't think the intended purpose was good, but I don't think people really understand it. And I don't think it's had the impact that I think a lot of people hoped it would when it was first introduced. It sounded good in concept, but I don't think it's played out as well or as much as people thought it would.
So we're going to have to wrap up at some point, I think. I am on all fours with you guys because I just think the real estate sector has got the kind of vitality and can-do spirit. You've already demonstrated. I mean, your sector, yes, could be a lot better, but it's not bad given the challenges that are out there, and it's going to get better as we open up. But I would like to have any ideas that people have about reinventing the state of Maryland and any creative approaches where the private sector can experiment with the public sector as a junior partner. Seriously, I think there's, every problem like the problem we're facing right now as a country and as a state, every problem's an opportunity to do something better. So let's, let's do it together if we can. Let's do it individually if we have to, but let's make the state better. And I think that's the silver lining that I see to what is a relatively gloom and doom situation right now.
Thank you. That's a great message to end on, and we do appreciate your time. We are approaching our time. So thank you again, Mr. Comptroller, and we look forward to continuing dialogue with you. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. And is Bill Castelli still with you?
Yeah, he's on the call. Actually, he had some charts he wanted to throw up, but I said no.
Well, he can come anytime and visit with me in the comptroller's office. And, thank you guys very much for everything you represent for our great state. I can't tell you how important the optimism. I often say that you guys have, it's in your DNA or something, but how you can stay resilient despite the ups and downs of the market is always something I am in awe of. And please, let's stay in touch because I personally really appreciate it.
Thank you
For
very
sure.
much.
Thanks again.
Okay, take care. I'm going to sign off.
Okay, take care.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks everybody for attending. That was a great session. Thank you all. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.